More than 52 years ago, right in the heart of the world's longest mountain range, a plane flew straight into a mountain and vanished almost immediately after the crash. The astonishing part, it simply disappeared. The 8,900-kilometer-long Andes Mountains in South America are home to snow-capped peaks rising above 15,000 feet. These towering summits offer nothing but silence, bone-chilling cold, and a landscape so isolated that hope seems impossible. Days passed without any trace of the aircraft, no wreckage, no bodies, no signs. Eventually, authorities concluded that no one could have possibly survived, and they officially called off the search. For a few days, the incident remained in the news, but gradually, the world moved on, forgetting the tragedy as time passed. Then, nearly 2.5 months later, exactly 72 days after the crash, a shocking radio message was received. It came from the very aircraft that had vanished. Once again, the world's eyes turned to this long-forgotten disaster. The aircraft was Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. On October 12, 1972, the plane had taken off from Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, carrying a group of young rugby players en route to Santiago, Chile, for a match. In total, 40 passengers and 5 crew members were on board. As the plane flew over Argentina, bad weather forced it to land in the city of Mendoza. This was a precautionary move for Andes Mountains, standing tall between Argentina and Chile, were notorious for their dangerous weather and towering terrain. The plan was to stay overnight in Mendoza and resume the journey once the skies cleared. No one aboard could have imagined the ordeal awaiting them the next day. On Friday, October 13th, Flight 571 resumed its journey. The distance between Mendoza and Santiago is only about 180 kilometers, but nearly the entire stretch is a maze of snow-covered mountains. The flight route was supposed to head south first, allowing the plane to climb to a safe altitude, before turning west to cross the Andes through a gap known as Pass. From there, they would descend toward the Chilean city of, and finally land in Santiago. The pilot was experienced and had completed around 50 flights on this route. Confident in his abilities, he took off and followed the planned course. But as the aircraft climbed, a thick layer of clouds blanketed everything below, making visual navigation impossible. The pilot began relying on the control tower, which tracked the plane via radar and communicated location updates over radio. The co-pilot also used a traditional method known as dead reckoning, estimating the current position based on the last known location, time, and speed. At one point, believing they were near, the crew requested permission to descend. However, they had made a critical miscalculation. In reality, they were still deep within the Andes. Permission was granted. The aircraft turned and began descending. As it broke through the clouds, the crew was horrified to see a massive mountain peak directly in front of them. The pilot pulled the aircraft upward in a desperate attempt to gain altitude again, but it was too late. The tail of the aircraft struck the mountain, shearing off instantly. What followed was terrifying. The fuselage, now without its tail or wings, slid rapidly down a glacier, crashing and finally coming to a stop. 12 passengers died on impact, most of them seated at the back. Miraculously, 33 passengers survived the crash, though many were seriously injured. The open rear of the aircraft allowed freezing air to rush inside. They were stranded at 11,500 feet, surrounded by a blinding white world, with no sign of help. In those first hours, the survivors buried their dead in the snow. Meanwhile, authorities had launched a search operation, but they mistakenly believed the crash occurred in Chile. 4 planes scoured the suspected region, but the all-white fuselage blended perfectly into the snow. Nothing was found. For 10 days, aircraft from Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile joined in the search. A total of 11 planes flew overhead, and although several passed directly above the crash site, none noticed the survivors. The passengers attempted to signal using debris and even smeared lipstick on the fuselage to write a large SOS, but nothing worked. On October 21st, the search was officially called off. All passengers were declared dead. The survivors found a small radio in the cockpit, which they managed to get working. It was through this radio that they learned the worst. The search operation had ended. The last sliver of hope shattered. As days passed, more passengers succumbed to their injuries or the cold. Within 2 weeks, 5 more people died. Now, only 28 remained. Using the plane's wreckage and luggage, they tried to insulate the fuselage. They cut plastic from the cockpit to make makeshift goggles against the snow's glare, and fashioned snowshoes from seat cushions. Food, however, was running out. All they had were a few chocolate bars, jars of jam, some dried fruit, and a few bottles of wine. They rationed everything, but it lasted barely a week. Eventually, they began chewing cotton and bits of leather, but it made them sick. The reality of their situation soon set in. There were no animals, no plants, nothing in the Andes to provide energy or sustenance, and the crash site sat on a narrow ridge, impossible to descend or ascend without great risk. Weakened and starving, the survivors faced an unbearable decision. When all other options ran out, they were forced to resort to cannibalism. They ate the bodies of their dead friends. It was a heartbreaking choice, but it was the only way to stay alive. Then, on October 29th to 17th, days after the Krishan avalanche struck in the middle of the night, it hit with brutal force, burying the fuselage in snow. 9 more passengers were killed. The remaining 19 fought their way out, carving air holes to breathe. Days turned into weeks. Their physical conditions worsened. By December 12th, 60 days after the crash, 3 more had died. Only 16 remained. They realized they had just one option left: attempt to climb the western peak and search for help. 3 of the strongest survivors, Fernando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio, volunteered to hike out. They crafted sleeping bags and warm clothing from plain seat covers and jackets, and began their climb on December 12th. The hike was grueling. With no proper equipment, they climbed for 3 straight days in -30°C temperatures. When they finally reached the summit, they were met not with green valleys, but more endless snow-covered peaks. Turned back, but Parrado and Canessa pressed forward. For 10 more days, they trekked through the mountains, covering over 60 kilometers. Finally, they reached a valley with greenery, animals, and a flowing river. They drank from the water. Just then, across the river, they saw a man on horseback. The roar of the river made it impossible to communicate, but the man had an idea. He wrapped paper and a pen in a rock and threw it across. The survivors wrote a message explaining their ordeal and threw it back. The rider raced to alert authorities. At first, officials could hardly believe it. How could anyone survive for over 2 months in the Andes? But they acted quickly. Parrado and Canessa were rescued and given medical attention. On December 27, 1972, 72 days after the crash, 3 helicopters reached the crash site, guided by the directions of the survivors. Even the rescue pilots were stunned by the sheer difficulty of the terrain the 2 men had crossed. All 16 remaining survivors were rescued. They buried their dead teammates nearby and built a stone memorial at the site. That memorial still stands today, a testament to human resilience. This story of Flight 571 reminds us all that, with courage, determination, and unity, even the most impossible situations can be overcome.